Hello and welcome to TMI with Aldous Tyler for Friday, April 9th, 2021. Coming to you, as always, from beautiful Madison, Wisconsin. Now, one of the topics that I do broach with some frequency here on TMI is socialism, just flat out. And it's not just because of good old Bernie Sanders. Mind you, he, of course, made the conversation much more public and, frankly, more accessible to a lot of people because he started talking about it and people started looking into it. But that said, we've been chatting about it now for, I don't know, I think since we started in 2009. And the fact is that I do firmly believe that it, or something very much like it, is probably the solution we need in order to overcome a lot of the woes that we talk about elsewise on the show. Your climate change, your just income inequality, so many things. But I'm not the only one who feels this way, I'm happy to say. Joining us today, author John Beacham has a book out called 2020, Socialism and the Coming Great Crisis. And I'm very pleased to say he's with us right now. John, welcome to TMI.
Oh, I'm very, very pleased to join you. And let me just out myself and join in your intro and say I do happen to be a socialist as well.
Well,
it happens. It happens.
I go between socialist and populist. Populist, by the definition, as appropriate to what populism is supposed to be.
Gotcha.
Not the bastardized version that the Europeans have decided it should mean. But basically, yes, I'm firmly of the belief that any form of government we have should be working for the people, period. And generally speaking, socialism is one of the forms that seems to do that very well, at least in my opinion. Now, in the book that you've put out here, you've got several different things that you wanted to make sure to get off your chest with it, of course. I mean, you have, I believe it's 16 theses on socialism as the first chapter, isn't it?
It is. And off my chest, yes. In order to be helpful to people, hopefully. I don't really conceive of doing anything like this unless I think it's going to be helpful to people in terms of understanding the political situation that we're in. Some of the things you mentioned, we are living in a time of greater crises, and more acute crises, including the environmental crisis. We're also rushing towards I believe, not rushing maybe, but heading towards a World War III, the way things are going with the U.S. sort of assault on Russia and China. And of course, there's the rise of white supremacy, an absolute scourge. And we do not as yet have a type of resistance or a big enough resistance to do what's necessary as a people in the United States and around the world to avert those crises. I mean, we know they're still mounting and they're not being stopped. The centers of power here in the United States specifically do not have the leadership, and hear from either party, that has the will or the interest to do what's necessary in order to avert the crisis. I mean, you don't have to look any further than the pandemic. I mean, almost 600,000 dead, according to the government statistics, which might be low, because we know there's people in this country that are uncounted on a daily basis. So their deaths are going to be uncounted. I mean, we know this.
True enough.
Yeah. And look, how has this country handled the pandemic? It couldn't be worse. The richest country in the history of the world couldn't have handled this pandemic any worse. There's absolutely no organization of the response to the pandemic, or very little, not what's necessary, and no economic relief. I mean, people have literally been left to scramble. And you even got it where, one more thing, just really quick. We have a thing here where, like, I have an 8-year-old son. I have been unemployed since last June. Luckily, my wife works and is a nurse, so has a decent, sort of union salary. But like, we have to be like, okay, are we going to send him back to school? Or are we not going to send him back to school? And the Democrats are the ones telling everybody to send their kids back to school. I understand people want their kids to go back to school. I have an 8-year-old son. I know why people want their kids to go back to school. But we're in this position where we got to. We can we trust that they're going to actually send them back safely?
Well, and that's actually a decent question, given that just the other day here in Madison, we had a daycare facility that had to be shut down because all of a sudden there were 24 cases out of the kids that were going there and the workers there of the coronavirus, specifically the British variant, that is more contagious. And then now in Michigan, they're reporting that they've had a 24% increase in cases since their schools opened there. And basically at this point, it's like all of these assurances we were given that, oh, schools won't be any kind of a major vector, appear to simply be proven false by the facts on their face. One thing I did want to also add too is that when people hear someone like you or myself say that we've had the worst possible response for being how wealthy a country we are, they tend to want to poo-poo that as an exaggeration. But I would like to remind people that the United States makes up just barely more than 4% of the world population, and yet we've had, what was it, somewhere about 26 or 27% of the world's deaths of coronavirus, more?
That's, yeah. I mean, there are countries, I'm not sure what your take is on China, and I know people have different impressions of what China is, but I mean, that was the epicenter of the pandemic. And, you know how many deaths they've had since Biden became president in China?
I believe it's a very low number.
It's 1. You know how many deaths there have been in the United States since Biden was inaugurated on January 20th?
Now that's...
I'll tell you, because I looked at it, because I figured it out. It's 160,000 people have died.
Yeah, that sounds about around the figure I was reading.
And places like New Zealand, South Korea, you just go down. You can go almost down the list. I mean, Europe hasn't done all that well either, honestly. But there's plenty of places that are with much less resources, like Cuba, that have done excellent. Considering comparatively.
And John, one of the things I'd like to remind people too is that if they're going to go ahead and say, well, but wait a minute, Joe Biden came in on January 20th, and it's going to take a little bit of time to stop this train, I would say, okay, that would be maybe a valid argument, except that the death rate has not been slowing significantly.
That's true. And also, you know what? We're in a surge. I mean, like the cases are going up. And with Biden saying we need to, everybody, we're going to get back to normal, we'll roll the vaccines out. You need to open your schools. Businesses need to be open. This is what Democratic and Republican governors are doing all across the country. Yesterday, there were 40,000 fans in watching the Texas Rangers in Houston play baseball, most of them unmasked. Because the Texas governor said no mask mandate, even though the stadium said you got to wear a mask, hardly anybody there was wearing a mask. So you actually have direct policy of the Democrats who have said we need to open up. And you have people who would be more likely to resist the government's policies, bad policies in the pandemic, going along with it because they've generally been Biden supporters. So honestly, and I'm not blaming the Biden supporters, actually. I'm blaming the Biden administration and the capitalist class here for putting the economy over people's lives.
Well,
I mean, they can write a check. They can just write us checks. You know what I mean? They've already done it. They just write more checks.
It's not like they haven't taken the value needed out of the economy already to give to people who don't need it, the right. Extremely wealthy, the top 1% and then some. That same amount of money spread amongst those of us who just needed to survive could go way further and keep us all very safe much longer.
Oh my gosh. Like, there's no question there's enough resources. There's even enough organizational capability. I mean, look at the way Amazon and just a couple examples of grocery chains, look at the way they've been to completely almost reorient the economy towards using technology to delivery. And, are there any shortage of people who are signing up to be delivery drivers? There's no labor shortage. There's no technology shortage. There's no shortage in terms of resources or wealth. I mean, anything that this country wants. I mean, look, we just didn't have to have the type of death toll and misery and economic woes that we've had here. I mean, and homelessness is on the rise here in Seattle, but you know what they've done here in Seattle? Homelessness is on the rise. You know what they've done? And I was talking to this about my partner, Stephanie, the last couple of days. Everywhere in the news here, it's like, there's crime, there's homelessness. They're victimizing the people who doubly victimizing the people who have been the most affected, like including the Black community here and across the country. The most victimized by this pandemic. Then they just heap it on them when they try to just survive. You know, it's absolutely disgusting. So to just track back to everything, I mean, I think millions and millions, tens of millions of people are acutely aware that things are not working. It's probably more than that. And it may seem overly simplistic, but just socialism, a redistribution of wealth and power actually being in people's hands, I would say the working class's hands. I see no other reason. To me, it's just a sort of a logical, I wouldn't even say moral place to come to, that we need a different type of system, or else, we're going to have the problems we're having are going to get not just worse, they're going to become catastrophic. I'll tell you, like when I started, I've been I've been an active socialist for many, many years now. Some have been a socialist, some people have been a socialist for longer than that. I don't want to overblow it. But when I started this, I would never get on a radio show or write in the book saying that, like, there's a catastrophe coming, because, who wants to predict that? Who wants to be the person out there, sort of, for lack of a better way of putting it, sort of chicken littling it?
Exactly. You don't want to be put into that category, and of course put the word socialism with it, because it's something that you hold near and dear to you and believe could be a solution. So you don't want to discredit it. I get that.
Sure. Well, but it wasn't totally clear that was, I mean, as a socialist, I would say, look, something has to happen about capitalism, about the vastly uneven distribution of wealth, or else there's going to be an explosion. Like, I would say that to people. But, you don't want to, at that point, though, I wouldn't want to say, look, it's either like socialism or else. But it is. I'm just going to, I mean, the reason why I wrote the book, 2020 Socialism and the Coming Great Crisis, I know I'm doing a plug, it is because of that. Because it literally, I think people, not only it needs to be, there's a, we assess the time period we're in, there needs to be an antidote to what we're going through, but it also needs to be impressed upon people that the times are very serious.
Yes, absolutely.
They're very serious.
Allow me to remind my listeners, if they're interested, that johnbeacham.com, that's JOHNBEACHAM.com, is where they can go and find more information about your book, as well as the other things you've been into and up to of late.
That's true.
I encourage people to do. But again, it's one of those things where if anybody finds anything of interest I'm doing, I try to make sure they have resources to go check further. So that's where I'm encouraging that. Now, John, one of the things that has always caught my attention is that even the foundation of this country, while not socialist in nature per se, the founders understood an awful lot about it. Even the simple thing about, gentlemen, we must hang together or surely we'll hang separately, applies, because I think that's where we're at right now in the case of these world crises. If we do not come together, if we do not together find a solution and support each other truly, which is what socialism is all about, we're going to find ourselves hung on plenty of individual little threads.
Well, I agree. You've actually brought up a subject I have studied and taught. I'm also a college writing teacher, but I teach writing from sort of historical, political, and even current event perspective in the sort of founding of this country. Mm-hmm. But before I say that, let me say the website where you can get the book. You can get the book on johnbeacham.com, but there's also other writing. I write poetry and flash fiction and science fiction.
Right. All worth looking at.
Yeah, totally. Is mass-action.org. Mass Action is the podcast. There's a podcast and there's articles there.
Gotcha.
And there's also links to some of my writing. The book is on both places.
mass-action.com.
Yeah, .org.
.org. Gotcha. Yeah, that's cool. So that's John Beacham's podcast, and book can be also found at mass-action.org. All right,
that's great. I appreciate you doing this at all. I really do, and helping get this out.
So John, you were saying that me touching on Ben Franklin's famous quote comes back to what you do at the college there sometimes.
Yeah, well, I think it's very interesting because a lot of people don't know that this country was founded through means which people now would be like, oh, you can't do that. Because I really believe like the powers that be here need to face a serious challenge. The masses of people need to be prepared to take them on all different levels. I don't advocate violence. I mean, I do advocate people being able to protect themselves and defend themselves by any means necessary, like Malcolm X and others. But I think if we were to be completely honest, that the powers that be here, I mean, just look at the way that the police forces act towards Black people in this country.
Oh, yes.
That they're not going to go without a fight. I think people need to be prepared to fight. And the United States only exists because people fought. In fact, they took up arms. The only way slavery was ended actually was by a war. I mean, to be totally honest. And that was a very important thing for it to happen historically, that slavery was ended here. People started fighting. People usually think Declaration of Independence, so on and so forth, when, a bunch of old white men, rich, and mostly slave owners met and said, we declare our independence. But everybody also knows that the fighting started a year before that. And for decades before that, there was fighting in the streets. And, people, the Boston Tea Party was an act of terrorism, straight up and just straightforward.
By any modern definition, absolutely.
Well, there was a reason why that the people in the independence movement here boycotted British tea, because British tea was a drug, by the way, caffeine, that the British Empire, got in, places in Asia and brought to other places in order to sell. And, people were addicted to, before coffee, tea was a thing that people drank.
Oh, yes.
To wake up in the morning and to stay awake at work. And that tea was potent.
Mm-hmm. And it was the East India Tea Company made sure of that.
Yeah. And so dumping all that tea into Boston Harbor, it was millions of dollars worth of tea at the time. Do you know what I mean? So it was a very, very serious act. And so, you have that, and then you also have the Constitution here, right? That was by quote unquote founding fathers, which was drafted in secret, by the way, again by mostly slave owners, who, including James Madison, who was the principal framer of the Constitution, was very, very specific. Actually, I actually read a couple passages to my students from James Madison and from the Articles of Confederation. What's that book where they're all put together? I think it's not the Articles of Confederation was before the Constitution.
Right.
I can't remember the name of the book. It's letter something. It's really horrible. I can't remember it. But anyway, the James Madison was arguing for the Constitution being passed, which narrowly passed, by the way. Thomas Jefferson, you mentioned Benjamin Franklin. Thomas Jefferson was against it. So it narrowly passed. And the thing that they were very specific about is that the U.S. government should be set up to protect the minority of landowners from the majority of the rest of the population. That the reason, for example, the president, the Senate, and the Supreme Court were not elected, and the senators were not elected until the 20th century, by the way.
Oh, yes. Now, a lot of people don't realize that at all.
Yeah. Well, and the reason why and in fact, in the first election when George Washington was elected, there was no popular election, right? And the president was only elected in 6 out of the 10 original states. I'm sorry, there was a popular election in only 6 out of the 10 states.
Right.
And in most of those states, you couldn't vote unless you were a Christian and owned property. And not just Christian, you had to be like a Protestant Christian.
Oh, well, yes, because at that point, Catholic wasn't considered Christian, not in this country.
Yeah. So they were very sure. The main driving force for those people who actually signed the Constitution and tried to get it passed as the new framework for U.S. government, they were very specific about it being a document to protect the ruling class, the majority of whom, especially the upper echelon of them, were slave owners who own people based on the color of skin. So this is the last thing I promise I'll stop talking and hand you back over the mic. This is what any type of just like fundamental change that needs to happen in human society. It needs to have a revolution and all of the components to go along with that. And so the main reason I wrote the book is not just to be another socialist thing, is to say these times are really serious, and in order for us to do something about it, we also have to be serious and take our rights to do anything that is necessary in order to bring the changes that again are necessary into being, not as a sort of not as a book, not as sort of an outline or some practice, and not something in our heads, but like in reality.
Right. Something that actually is practiced versus just spoken about.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned the 16 theses. Some of those theses actually, deal with very specific things about how, people who are in the same political party, a revolutionary party, um, seriously, just straight up, like how you discipline yourself and what that means. Discipline in terms of like how you comport yourself, behave, and how you act as a political actor with other human beings. The
Mhm.
types of things I think you should and shouldn't do. The types of
Well,
things you should advocate for.
it's certainly important to not only have a cause to advocate for, but to not alienate everybody you run across when you're advocating for it, or you're not going to gain any support. And so I definitely agree with you there that
Yeah.
it's that you need to be reaching people, not just showing them what you think, but
Mm-hmm.
trying to get them to understand why thinking that way is something maybe they would also find attractive.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I also agree, and I don't think it's a contradiction, is that we shouldn't be afraid to say things that might, if they're necessary, the necessary things that might alienate people.
Oh, yes.
Because some of those things are just, I think there's no getting around them. So we should just deal with people the way you just said, right? But at the same time, say, look, I understand where you're coming from. I understand this is a difficult thing for most people. There's lots of disagreements. But for example, I believe the reason why China was able to do much better at the pandemic is because they have a different type of social organization that has socialistic characteristics about it. I know no other way to explain that situation of how China has done so well as the epicenter of the pandemic, losing barely anyone after the first month.
I mean, when you're talking about a country of over 1 billion people, and you compare it then to here, where we have less than a third of that many people, and you take a look at the death rates between the two, not just month by month, although that's also very, very
Right.
illustrative, but also just even in total and clearly, we were not doing it the right way. Obviously, there were better ways to do it.
That's
And
right.
interestingly enough, the closer you get to our model here of governance, the more difficulty people seem to be having. Great Britain, for example,
Hmm.
and or for that matter, even your Italy's and other places that throughout Europe are maybe a little bit closer to what we do here. Sure, they have some uh, social democracy built into their system to help buffer some of the ravages of capitalism, but they're still closer to what we do here than, say, for example, China or someplace else, which, again, with China, over 1 billion people, and the way they've been able to handle the amount of deaths from this is just phenomenally better. Now,
Hmm.
I'm not saying that we should all absolutely mimic China, but, doesn't mean we can't learn from them.
Oh yeah. And that's the bare minimum thing here. What has this country done instead of learning and cooperating with China? I mean, the media, they're all Democrats. I mean, Joe Biden campaigned on "I will be tougher on China,"
Yeah.
and so his rhetoric, his anti-China rhetoric, which is just replete all over when you call the leader of another country a thug, which Biden does, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
that's the type of language to use, not especially during a pandemic. I mean, and with a country that's doing better, right, than you are and could help. Cooperation should be the deal, but this is not a socialist country, so cooperation is not on the table. For me, I characterize this as an imperialist country we're living in. And what has this country done? Because it's an imperialist country and a racist country, from my point of view, they've demonized China. The attacks against Asian people here in the United States have climbed astronomically during the pandemic, because even if politicians aren't saying it's a Chinese flu, which is just the most god awful thing you could say come out of your mouth during something like this happening. And we're talking about people who are in positions of power. But even if you're not saying that at this point or at any point, like sort of going after China in the way that the both parties have done is just despicable. And but the reason why they're doing it, if people are paying attention, he admitted the other day. He said, you know what the deal is with China? They're not going to surpass us as economically or as a political power as long as I'm in charge. So, in other words, the entire orientation of the United States to China is keeping China in its place. And that, again, is the most ridiculous thing you could ever think of, because, again, we're talking about 1 billion people, the biggest country on the planet. Are you following me?
Well, yeah.
And you can't that's like saying human beings are not allowed to pursue their own basic economic interests as long as the United States exists.
Well, and when you come across the very base definition of what creates economic value, and that's labor, if you have over 1 billion people, there's going to be more economic value in a country like China than in the United States. There's no two ways about it. And the fact that Biden would even pretend that we are still somehow dominant over China in an economic fashion is just yet another example of him being just a little out of touch.
Well, that's the predicament we're in. And again, one of the reasons why I wrote the book, the predicament we're in is that there's no reason to stop other human beings from rising. There's no reason you can think of to stop another human being or another country from rising, economically and prospering. Now, there's all different issues. This obviously doesn't apply to like a fascist country or something like that.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
But that's not what's happening. China is not the aggressor, and Russia is not the aggressor here. Honestly, I mean, come on. Just the other day, the Biden administration was claiming that the fact that Russian troops are on the border of Ukraine is sort of a catastrophic threat to world peace. Russia is on the border of Ukraine.
Yes.
Russian troops can be in Russia. I mean, do you know what I mean? Like, that's to say Russia has no right to have a military base.
We would find it equally ridiculous if somebody was criticizing us for having American troops on the border with Mexico. It's our border as well. So
you know what? The U.S. has troops on the Russian border.
Yes, we do.
And they facilitated Germany having troops on the Russian border for the first time since World War II. I mean, and the U.S. is running military exercises every year where they literally do a mock attack of Russia, including nuclear weapons, on the border of Russia. Can you imagine if Russia was in Mexico and Canada every year? They had their troops based there, and they were actually going through drills to practice annihilating the United States with nuclear weapons. That would
drive us crazy.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing, is like at this particular point in time, as many people as possible need to have the world the right side up. Yeah. Whatever you think about Russia or China, and whatever you think about the relationship between countries in the world, right now, the U.S. is trying to accuse Russia and China of being the aggressors. Russia's military budget is 1/10 the size of the United States. China's budget is 1/5 the size of the United States. And if we're to be totally honest, a lot of that is defensive.
Right. No, totally.
I mean,
all right. I'd like to remind my viewers and listeners that they have got TMI with Aldous Tyler. We are having a conversation with John Beacham. He's got a book, 2020 Socialism and the Coming Great Crisis. You can find it at mass-action.org. John, I really want to thank you for coming on and talking about all these things here today. Could I perhaps count on you coming back sometime?
Oh, it'd be my pleasure, actually. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much, John. And again, mass-action.org. Good place to check out what John's up to. Has his own podcast. So, hey, if you like the conversation we've been having, you can hear his voice a little bit more over there, too. All right. John, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You've been listening to TMI with Aldous Tyler. We'll be right back.